She was hiding something bigger than just her ex. What I found changed everything. At 38, I thought I had mastered the delicate balance of love and trust. My career as a senior investment advisor was thriving, my relationship with Victoria seemed unshakable, and life in Seattle felt perfectly orchestrated. But when she looked me straight in the eye and said, "Maybe we shouldn't be together if you can't handle my ex being around," I nodded calmly and agreed. 3 days later, when her phone lit up with, "Where are you?" on a Friday evening, I sent her a photo from the Emirates first-class lounge at London Heathrow. Caption: Executive position accepted. Ticket, one way. Some would call this petty revenge. What a 38-year-old learned about human nature that night changed everything I believed about loyalty and justice. I'm not the type of man who keeps emotional scorecards in relationships, but even the most patient soul has breaking points that, once crossed, transform everything. My name is Christopher, and for 3 soul-crushing years, I had been entangled with Victoria, a marketing executive whose magnetic charisma could light up corporate boardrooms and intimate dinner parties with equal brilliance. She possessed that rare spark of intellectual energy that made CEOs and artists alike gravitate toward her presence, hanging on every perfectly crafted word that fell from her lips. When we first met at a networking event downtown, I was convinced she was exactly what my work-obsessed life desperately needed. Someone vivacious, someone spontaneous, someone who could drag me away from quarterly reports and investment portfolios into a world where passion still mattered. Have you ever met someone who seemed to embody everything missing from your carefully structured existence? At first, I rationalized the small intrusions that should have sent me running. Victoria mentioned her ex-boyfriend Marcus in casual conversation with a frequency that made my stomach churn, but I convinced myself it was merely harmless nostalgia. She framed their connection as ancient history, claiming they had grown up in the same affluent neighborhood and still shared an extensive network of mutual friends from their private school days. I figured mature adults could maintain civilized friendships with former lovers if they had genuinely moved on, so I gave her every benefit of every doubt. But as months transformed into years, it became devastatingly clear that Marcus wasn't just a faded photograph from her past. He was aggressively, manipulatively present in every corner of our relationship, like a malignant tumor that had metastasized throughout our entire life together. It began with seemingly innocent intrusions that gradually escalated into full-scale emotional warfare. A text message here, a phone call there, then group social gatherings where Marcus mysteriously appeared as though summoned by some invisible force. I remember one particular evening when Victoria and I had planned an intimate dinner at our favorite French restaurant in Queen Anne. She had made reservations weeks in advance, selected a bottle of vintage Bordeaux, and we were just settling into our corner table when her phone buzzed with an urgency that made her entire body tense. She glanced at the screen, her face transforming with a smile I had never seen her direct toward me, and excused herself with a whispered apology. 20 minutes passed, then 45. When I finally went searching, I found her in the restaurant's elegant foyer, laughing into her phone with an intimacy that felt like a knife sliding between my ribs. I heard Marcus's name float through her conversation like a sacred incantation. She noticed me watching and turned away quickly, her voice dropping to conspiratorial whispers about him navigating some fabricated crisis that apparently required her immediate emotional support. Our carefully planned evening dissolved into cold soup and uncomfortable silence. My colleagues began noticing the pattern before I was willing to admit it existed. My partner at the firm, Douglas, once remarked with brutal honesty that Marcus might as well receive a formal invitation to our company holiday parties, given how frequently he monopolized Victoria's attention during our social events. I forced laughter at the time, but his observation echoed in my mind during countless sleepless nights, mixing with my growing suspicions like poison in my bloodstream. At gatherings throughout the city's financial district, Marcus would materialize uninvited, claiming Victoria had mentioned the event during one of their casual conversations. He moved through crowds with the practiced confidence of someone who believed he belonged everywhere, always positioning himself too close to her, always testing boundaries with the calculated precision of a predator who had studied his prey for years. When I confronted Victoria about his inappropriate behavior, she dismissed my concerns with the psychological weapon she wielded most effectively: accusations of jealousy, and emotional insecurity. That word, insecure, became her favorite shield against any reasonable questioning of their relationship. If I dared mention why Marcus needed to attend every celebration, why his name illuminated her phone during our most intimate moments, or why he still possessed the security code to her luxury condominium, she would expertly redirect the conversation back to my alleged character defects. She painted herself as an innocent victim of my controlling nature while positioning me as an emotionally unstable man who couldn't handle her sophisticated approach to adult relationships. Months of this psychological manipulation wore down my sense of reality until I started questioning my own perceptions. Was I overreacting to normal friendship behaviors? Was my discomfort really just primitive jealousy disguised as legitimate concern? But the destructive pattern never changed, never improved, never acknowledged my feelings as valid human responses to obvious disrespect. The final, soul-crushing revelation arrived on a Wednesday evening that will forever be burned into my memory. I had stayed late at the office preparing a crucial presentation for international clients, and when I finally returned to Victoria's place around midnight, I discovered Marcus sitting comfortably on her Italian leather sofa, sharing takeout containers with her like he was a permanent resident rather than an uninvited intruder. She didn't even possess the decency to look embarrassed or surprised. She greeted me with casual indifference, reintroduced Marcus as though we hadn't already endured countless uncomfortable encounters, and continued their conversation as though my presence was merely an inconvenient interruption to their evening together. That night, something fundamental shifted in the architecture of my soul. We argued for the first time without restraint or diplomatic courtesy. I didn't hold back the accumulated pain, the systematic erosion of my dignity, the constant feeling of competing with a ghost who seemed to possess more access to my girlfriend's heart than I ever would. I told her how profoundly disrespected I felt, how her unwavering loyalty to Marcus crossed every reasonable boundary, and how this wasn't about insecurity, but about basic human decency in committed relationships. She listened to my emotional outburst in complete silence, then calmly set down her wine glass, leaned back in her chair with the composed confidence of someone delivering a final verdict, and spoke words that sliced through my chest like a surgeon's blade. Maybe we shouldn't be together if you can't handle my ex being around. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything I had ever experienced. I didn't yell, didn't plead, didn't attempt to negotiate with someone who had just revealed the true hierarchy of her affections. I simply nodded with a clarity that surprised us both. Maybe you're absolutely right. I watched her expression flicker with something that might have been panic, perhaps expecting me to argue or beg for another chance to prove my worthiness. But I'd finally heard her message with perfect comprehension. For the first time in 3 years, I felt something powerful and liberating shift inside my chest. The death of hope and the birth of self-respect. The next morning at my investment firm, the universe delivered what felt like divine intervention wrapped in a business proposal. My senior partner called me into his mahogany-paneled office with unexpected news that would reshape my entire existence. The company was launching an ambitious new wealth management division in London, and they wanted someone with my experience and international credentials to oversee the European operations. It represented a massive promotion, significantly higher compensation, and the opportunity to build something magnificent from the ground up. Most rational people would have requested time to consider such a life-altering decision, weighing career benefits against personal costs. For me, it felt like the answer to prayers I hadn't even realized I'd been sending into the cosmos. Victoria had drawn her line in the sand with brutal clarity. I refused to waste another moment fighting for a woman who made me compete with shadows from her past while treating my love like a consolation prize. The London position was my golden ticket to escape everything toxic that had been slowly poisoning my spirit for 3 devastating years. I didn't inform Victoria immediately about my decision. Instead, I moved through our final days together like an actor playing a familiar role while secretly orchestrating my liberation. I quietly liquidated unnecessary possessions, organized my financial portfolios for international transfer, and booked my one-way ticket to Heathrow with the methodical precision of someone planning the most important escape of his life. Each step felt like shedding layers of accumulated resentment and disappointment. Meanwhile, Victoria grew increasingly distant, spending more time with Marcus and less energy pretending to care about my emotional state. Her indifference actually made my detachment easier, like watching someone else's relationship dissolve from a comfortable distance. I stopped asking questions about her whereabouts, stopped caring whether she came home at reasonable hours. She seemed satisfied with my apparent resignation, mistaking my strategic silence for defeated acceptance of her terms. Then came that perfect Friday evening when everything aligned like stars forming a constellation of poetic justice. She was out again with her usual crowd, though we both understood Marcus would be there as her real priority. Around 10:30 p.m., as I sat in the Emirates first-class lounge at Heathrow Airport, my phone buzzed with a text from her that made me smile with genuine amusement for the first time in months. "Where are you?" The timing was so exquisite it felt choreographed by cosmic forces with a sense of humor. She probably expected to find me sulking at home, waiting for her return like a faithful dog who had learned his place in her hierarchy of importance. Instead, I lifted my phone, angled the camera with artistic precision, and captured the moment perfectly. Me reclining in the luxurious leather seat of the first-class lounge, boarding pass visible in my manicured hand, champagne glass gleaming on the polished table beside me. Underneath the image, I typed with the satisfaction of someone finally speaking their truth. Executive position accepted. Ticket. One way. I pressed send and experienced the most intoxicating rush of freedom I had ever felt. For several minutes, I simply stared at our message thread, imagining her face when reality crashed into her comfortable assumptions. Her smug certainty cracking like expensive porcelain. Her illusion of complete control over my emotions dissolving into panic and disbelief. When my flight was called for boarding, I felt lighter than I had in years, as though I were shedding not just geographical location, but an entire version of myself that had accepted disrespect as the price of love. I walked toward the gate with each step carrying me further from a relationship built on manipulation and emotional terrorism. I didn't know what adventures waited for me in London's financial district, but I knew exactly what I was leaving behind, and that knowledge felt like the greatest victory of my adult life. When I stepped off the plane into London's crisp morning air, it felt like being reborn into a parallel universe where my worth wasn't constantly questioned. Heathrow Airport alone radiated sophistication and possibility, with its soaring architecture and streams of international travelers pursuing their own ambitious dreams. Even at dawn, the city seemed to pulse with ancient energy mixed with cutting-edge innovation. For the first time in 3 years, I wasn't thinking about Victoria or Marcus or the poisonous dynamic that had nearly destroyed my confidence. I was thinking about board meetings and investment strategies, about building something extraordinary in one of the world's most competitive financial markets. The company had secured me a stunning apartment in Canary Wharf, all glass and steel with panoramic views of the Thames that made Seattle's skyline seem quaint by comparison. Within 48 hours, I was immersed in strategy sessions, client presentations, and endless introductions to London's financial elite. The workload was demanding, but I thrived on it with an energy I had forgotten I possessed. My new role transcended merely managing investment portfolios. I was architecting the future of an entire European division, making decisions that would affect millions of pounds and hundreds of careers. After years of feeling undervalued while Victoria's dramas consumed my emotional bandwidth, I finally experienced a sense of professional purpose that felt like coming home to myself. But ghosts from toxic relationships don't disappear overnight, even when separated by oceans and time zones. Victoria's name still appeared on my phone with the persistence of someone who couldn't accept that her emotional control had finally been broken. The morning after my airport revelation, she attempted to reach me 18 times in rapid succession, leaving increasingly frantic voicemails that oscillated between rage and desperate disbelief. She accused me of publicly humiliating her, of abandoning her like a coward, of blindsiding her with no explanation despite the fact that she had literally told me we shouldn't be together. The irony was so perfect it felt like poetry written by the universe itself. Over the following weeks, her emotional approach shifted like someone cycling through the stages of grief. The angry texts transformed into pleading messages, then evolved into carefully crafted emails that painted her as a misunderstood victim of circumstances beyond her control. She claimed Marcus was merely a friend and that I had dramatically overreacted to innocent interactions. She begged me to reconsider my decision, promising she could establish appropriate boundaries if I would just give her another chance to prove her commitment. I read every desperate word once, then archived them in a folder labeled "Closed Chapters" without responding. I had absolutely no intention of being pulled back into that psychological tornado, regardless of how convincingly she rewrote our history. Still, I would be dishonest if I claimed her absence didn't create some hollow spaces in my daily routine. After 3 years, even dysfunction becomes familiar, like background noise you don't notice until it suddenly stops. Some evenings, I found myself staring at London's glittering skyline from my apartment windows, wondering what she was doing, whether she missed me, whether Marcus had finally claimed the complete victory he had been pursuing for years. But those melancholy thoughts grew weaker each time I immersed myself more deeply in my new life. London had a way of demanding your complete attention, fueled by ambition and surrounded by brilliant minds from every corner of the globe. My team included sharp, driven professionals who challenged my thinking daily. One colleague, Isabel, particularly stood out from the crowd. She wasn't just a teammate but an external consultant, a brilliant Franco-British lawyer specializing in international corporate compliance. The first time we collaborated on a complex negotiation, she cut through heated arguments with such calm, surgical precision that the entire boardroom fell into respectful silence. She wasn't merely intellectually gifted. Isabel carried herself with quiet authority that commanded respect without ever raising her voice or resorting to aggressive tactics. When we met for coffee to discuss contract details, I expected professional small talk. Instead, we ended up discussing everything from European business law to hidden neighborhoods throughout London where authentic culture thrived beyond the polished business districts. For the first time since leaving Seattle, I felt like I had discovered a genuine friend who wasn't connected to my complicated past, someone who appreciated the person I was becoming rather than mourning the person I had been. Meanwhile, Victoria's desperate attempts to reconnect intensified rather than faded. 2 months after my departure, she managed to reach me through a different international number I didn't recognize. When I answered, her voice was more frantic than I had ever heard it, carrying an edge of genuine panic that cut through her usual manipulative techniques. She accused me of destroying her life, claimed Marcus had been manipulating her all along, and said she had no one left to turn to for help. Apparently, Marcus had been pressuring her into co-signing loans for his business ventures, investments that had turned out to be elaborate financial schemes. She admitted she was drowning in debt she hadn't understood when she signed the paperwork. I listened in complete silence, every part of me wanting to deliver the crushing response her betrayal deserved. I wanted to remind her how many times she had chosen his needs over mine, how consistently she had dismissed my concerns while protecting his access to her life. But I didn't unleash that emotional ammunition. Instead, I simply said, "You'll figure it out," and hung up without another word. That conversation left me profoundly unsettled, not because I wanted her back, but because I realized how rapidly her carefully constructed world was unraveling. Part of me wondered whether Marcus's business dealings were even legal, given his history of cutting corners and living on charm rather than legitimate success. I tried not to dwell on Victoria's problems because life in London demanded my complete focus. My workload had expanded exponentially, and with it, my influence within the company's European operations. I began participating in high-level meetings with regional directors, closing deals that would have been far beyond my reach back in Seattle's more limited market. The company provided every possible comfort: luxury housing, private transportation, even exclusive social events designed to integrate senior staff into London's expat financial community. It felt like a golden cage in some ways, but one I embraced wholeheartedly after years of emotional prison. On weekends, Isabel introduced me to circles outside our corporate bubble. Artists, entrepreneurs, and academics gathered in tucked-away pubs, trading ideas until the early hours of morning. It was a side of London most business travelers never discovered, and it grounded me in ways I hadn't expected. Through those connections, I started making personal investments in small ventures, technology startups, logistics services, sustainable energy projects. For the first time, my money wasn't just accumulating interest in traditional accounts. It was building something tangible and meaningful, always with Isabel's expert legal guidance protecting my interests. Victoria's shadow returned periodically, like storms that appeared on clear days. Another voicemail. Another desperate email. Once, she even attempted to reach me through my sister back in Seattle, spinning an elaborate sob story about betrayal and abandonment. My sister forwarded me Victoria's message without comment, but her response to Victoria was beautifully direct. He owes you absolutely nothing. That family solidarity felt like a final nail in the coffin of any guilt I might have carried about my decision to leave. Then came the revelation that changed everything I thought I understood about Victoria's situation. It arrived on a Thursday evening as I was leaving the office after a particularly challenging client meeting. I noticed a missed call from an unknown international number, followed immediately by an email with no subject line, just an attachment and a few ominous words. Thought you should see this. The attachment was a scanned document, loan papers signed by Victoria, but with my name listed as a financial guarantor. My blood turned to ice as I scrolled through page after page, realizing she had attempted to legally bind me to Marcus's debts. The dates were from just before my departure for London. If I hadn't moved when I did, if I hadn't severed ties completely, there was a terrifying possibility those forged documents would have slipped past my attention until I was drowning in legal obligations I had never agreed to accept. My chest tightened as the full implications crashed over me like a tsunami. She hadn't just played games with my emotions or disrespected our relationship. Victoria had been willing to risk my career, my financial stability, everything I had worked decades to build, just to provide Marcus with another layer of protection from his questionable business practices. That night, I sat by my apartment windows long after London had settled into quiet darkness. The Thames reflected city lights like scattered diamonds, indifferent to my private revelation about human nature's capacity for betrayal. I replayed every moment of our relationship, every warning sign I had ignored in the name of love and trust. The late-night phone calls, Marcus's constant presence, her dismissal of my legitimate concerns, and finally that devastating line, "Maybe we shouldn't be together if you can't handle my ex around." She had been absolutely right, though not in the way she imagined. I couldn't handle her ex, not because of insecurity, but because of survival instincts that had saved me from financial and legal destruction. By sunrise, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Victoria wasn't finished with her attempts to drag me back into her chaos. She had lost control over me, lost the unwitting shield I might have provided, and she wasn't going to accept that loss without fighting viciously to reclaim her power. What I didn't realize yet was exactly how far she was willing to go to restore her control, or how dangerous a desperate person becomes when their entire world starts collapsing around them. I had assumed that geographical distance would be sufficient to permanently sever ties with Victoria's toxic influence. Oceans separated us, demanding responsibilities consumed my days, and every professional step I took in London carried me further from the psychological mess I had left behind in Seattle. For several months, this strategy worked perfectly. I buried myself completely in my expanding role, cultivated relationships throughout London's financial community, and deepened my partnership with Isabel beyond professional collaboration. Life felt steady, even promising, like a garden finally growing after years of drought. Then one crisp autumn morning, I arrived at our office to find the receptionist pale and visibly nervous. She leaned toward me conspiratorially and whispered, "There's someone waiting for you in the main lobby." I assumed it was an early client meeting or perhaps one of our European partners arriving ahead of schedule. But when I stepped into the building's polished marble atrium, my blood transformed to liquid nitrogen. Victoria was standing there with red, sleepless eyes and a small suitcase at her feet, looking like she hadn't slept or eaten properly in weeks. She spotted me instantly and rushed forward with desperate urgency. Security personnel moved to intercept, but she raised both hands, insisting she only needed 5 minutes to explain everything. The lobby had fallen completely silent, with employees watching this personal drama unfold in our professional space. The last thing I wanted was a public spectacle that would become office gossip for months, so I reluctantly agreed to speak with her privately in a small conference room. The moment the door closed behind us, Victoria completely broke down. Tears streamed down her face as she launched into a frantic, rambling monologue that revealed the true extent of her desperation. She claimed Marcus had systematically destroyed her life, dragging her into fraudulent schemes she hadn't understood at the time. She spoke of debt collectors making threats, government investigators closing in on their operations, and her complete isolation as former friends and family members distanced themselves from the growing scandal. She begged me to help her, claiming I was the only person left in her life who possessed both the resources and connections to potentially save her from complete ruin. The woman sitting across from me was a hollow shadow of the confident, charismatic person who had once dismissed my concerns with casual arrogance and a shrug about not being able to handle her ex's presence. Her voice trembled, her hands shook uncontrollably, but my sympathy remained frozen. Instead of feeling pity, I found myself thinking about those forged loan documents with my name scrawled across them. Whether she had signed them out of desperation or calculated deception didn't matter anymore. She had crossed lines that could never be uncrossed. When her emotional performance finally ended, I simply said, "You shouldn't be here," opened the conference room door, and motioned for security to handle the situation. They escorted her from the building as she shouted over her shoulder with venom I had never heard from her before. "You'll regret this, Christopher. He's worse than you ever imagined." For the remainder of that day, I couldn't focus on anything productive. My colleagues noticed my distraction but politely avoided asking direct questions. In truth, Victoria's sudden appearance had terrified me more than I wanted to admit. She had crossed international borders to track me down, dragging Marcus's criminal shadow across continents like a plague she couldn't escape. If she was telling the truth about government investigations, then whatever storm surrounded Marcus was larger and more dangerous than I had ever realized. Later that week, Isabel invited me to an intimate dinner at a friend's townhouse in Notting Hill. It was a small gathering of legal professionals, private investors, and a few local entrepreneurs, sharing wine and conversation over perfectly prepared lamb. The discussion naturally turned to recent financial scandals that had been making headlines throughout European business publications. One guest, a senior banker, mentioned a name that made my entire body tense with recognition: Marcus. I remained silent, listening carefully as he explained that Marcus had been flagged by international financial regulators for suspicious money transfers, shell company operations, and fake contracts designed to launder profits through legitimate small businesses. The banker speculated that several people connected to Marcus's network might face serious criminal charges for conspiracy and fraud. The investigation was expanding rapidly, with authorities in multiple countries coordinating their efforts to unravel what appeared to be a sophisticated international scheme. I felt a chill crawl down my spine like ice water. Victoria hadn't been lying about the investigation closing in on their operations. During our drive home, I confided everything to Isabel: Marcus's history, Victoria's desperate visit, the forged loan documents that could have destroyed my financial future. She listened with the careful attention of someone trained to identify legal vulnerabilities, her brilliant mind processing implications I might have missed. Finally, she spoke with the clarity that had made her so successful. "If your name appears anywhere on those documents, you need to protect yourself immediately and comprehensively. Even if the signatures are obviously forged, you'll have to prove your innocence in court, and that process could damage your reputation regardless of the outcome." The next morning, we worked with Isabel's legal team to file formal statements with British and American authorities, preemptively disclosing the forged documents Victoria had created. We built an impenetrable shield around my reputation and finances before Marcus's storm could reach London's shores. I felt enormous relief, but also profound anger at how close I had come to destruction. The woman I had once trusted with my heart had nearly ruined my career, and the man she had chosen over me repeatedly had transformed her into collateral damage in his criminal enterprise. But Victoria's desperation hadn't reached its peak yet. 2 weeks after her office ambush, she appeared again, this time lurking outside my apartment building like someone conducting surveillance. I spotted her as I returned from a client dinner, standing near the entrance with a paper bag clutched against her chest as though it contained her last worldly possessions. She rushed toward me before I could retreat to safety, her voice carrying the manic energy of someone whose sanity was fracturing under pressure. "Please, Christopher, just listen to me for 1 minute." I never meant to drag you into this nightmare. I didn't understand what Marcus was really doing. I thought everything was legitimate business until investigators started asking questions. Now they think I'm part of his conspiracy, and I'm absolutely terrified." Her words tumbled out like water from a burst pipe, each sentence revealing deeper layers of her psychological collapse. She admitted she had signed legal documents without reading them carefully, trusted Marcus blindly despite mounting evidence of his dishonesty, and now found herself facing criminal charges she didn't fully comprehend. She begged me to vouch for her character to authorities, to tell investigators she had been naive rather than complicit, to use my professional reputation to provide her with credibility she no longer possessed. I stared at her in complete amazement at the audacity of her request. "You used my name without my consent," I said with controlled fury. "You attempted to legally bind me to his criminal debts, and now you expect me to risk my career to save you from consequences you chose?" She looked at me with wide, desperate eyes that reminded me of a drowning person grasping for any floating debris. "I was stupid, Christopher. I know that now with perfect clarity. But if I go to prison, they'll destroy what's left of my life. You don't understand, Marcus won't protect me anymore. He's prepared to let me take complete responsibility for everything." That revelation hit me harder than I expected because it exposed the ultimate truth about their relationship. Marcus had never genuinely cared for Victoria. She had been nothing more than another disposable pawn in his elaborate schemes, useful for providing legitimacy and cover but expendable when legal pressure mounted. The same man she had chosen over me countless times, whose presence she had defended so fiercely, had abandoned her to face criminal charges alone while he presumably planned his own escape strategy. But recognizing the injustice of her situation didn't create any obligation for me to rescue her from consequences she had actively created. Sympathy and forgiveness are entirely different emotional responses, and forgiveness requires genuine accountability that Victoria had never demonstrated. I shook my head, walked past her toward my building security entrance, and allowed the doorman to handle her continued pleas. Her desperate cries echoed behind me as the elevator doors closed, but I felt nothing except relief at being separated from her chaos once again. The following morning brought news that transformed everything. Isabel sent me a confidential report she had obtained through her legal network. Marcus had fled Britain during the night, abandoning Victoria and several other associates to face criminal charges alone. Authorities were tracking his movements across multiple European countries, and Victoria had been officially named as a primary suspect in the international fraud investigation. If investigators determined she had been complicit rather than merely naive, she could face decades in prison for conspiracy, money laundering, and financial fraud. I sat in my office, staring at the report while London's financial district buzzed with activity outside my windows. Cosmic justice doesn't always move swiftly, but when it finally acts, the results can be more devastating than anything human revenge could accomplish. Victoria had once told me with supreme confidence that maybe we shouldn't be together if I couldn't handle her ex being around. Now that same ex had pulled her into a whirlpool of legal consequences she couldn't escape, while I sat safely in London, protected by decisions I had made before understanding their full importance. The irony was so perfect it felt like poetry. By leaving when I did, by walking away without dramatic confrontations or attempts to compete for her attention, I had avoided being dragged down with both of them. Still, part of my mind wondered whether Victoria's desperation would drive her to even more dangerous actions. Would she risk everything in one final attempt to drag me back into her sinking ship? I didn't have to wonder for long. That evening, as I left the office after a successful presentation to Swiss investors, I discovered an envelope tucked under my car's windshield wiper. Inside was a handwritten note that made my blood freeze. "They're coming for me tomorrow. If you don't help me now, I'll tell investigators you knew about everything from the beginning." I stood in the parking garage, surrounded by luxury vehicles and the echo of my own breathing, as Victoria's final threat burned in my hands. The note wasn't just desperate. It was a declaration of war against someone who had tried to save himself from her destruction. That handwritten threat represented the moment I realized Victoria wasn't just a closed chapter from my past. She had become a storm still circling my new life, and I was standing directly in her path with nowhere left to run. The note trembled in my hands as I read Victoria's desperate ultimatum again and again. Her handwriting was erratic, the ink smudged as though her hands had been shaking violently while she wrote. "They're coming for me tomorrow. If you don't help me now, I'll tell investigators you knew about everything from the beginning." It wasn't just a plea for assistance. It was emotional terrorism designed to drag me down with her sinking ship. I immediately drove to Isabel's office, where she was working late on another international case. She read the note without any visible reaction, then folded it carefully and placed it on her mahogany desk like evidence in a criminal trial. "She's completely cornered now," Isabel said with the calm analysis of someone who had seen desperate people make similar threats. "When facing destruction, people lash out at anyone within reach, but you have absolutely nothing to fear. We've already established a comprehensive paper trail of disclosure. If she attempts to implicate you falsely, her claims won't survive scrutiny." Her professional confidence steadied me, but I couldn't ignore the fundamental unpredictability of Victoria's mental state. She wasn't operating from logic anymore, she was pure chaos in human form. A cornered person can inflict tremendous damage even when their eventual defeat is inevitable. I immediately implemented additional security measures, changed all my phone numbers, added extra layers of protection at both work and home, and formally notified British authorities about Victoria's threat. Every interaction was now documented, creating an official record of her escalating attempts to manipulate me back into her legal nightmare. 6 weeks later, the storm finally broke with the force of a Category 5 hurricane. I was attending a black-tie charity gala with Isabel at the Dorchester, surrounded by London's financial elite in an atmosphere of champagne, classical music, and sophisticated conversation. Midway through the evening, a ripple of whispers spread across the ballroom like wildfire. Phones illuminated throughout the crowd as people checked breaking news alerts simultaneously. Isabel leaned toward me and whispered with barely contained excitement, "It's about Marcus." News had broken that he had been arrested while attempting to flee Cyprus using sophisticated false identity documents. Authorities had been monitoring his movements for months, and he was captured with fake passports, encrypted hard drives containing financial records, and nearly £2 million in untraceable cryptocurrency. Within hours, details flooded international press coverage. Marcus had laundered over £50 million through shell companies, created fraudulent investment schemes that had destroyed hundreds of lives across 4 countries, and left a trail of financial devastation that investigators were still trying to fully comprehend. At the center of numerous transactions, Victoria's name appeared prominently as both a co-conspirator and a victim of his manipulation. My phone buzzed constantly with messages from acquaintances back in Seattle. Some people knew my history with Victoria intimately, while others had only vague memories of our relationship. But everyone wanted to discuss the scandal that had consumed international business news. I remained completely silent, watching Victoria's public destruction unfold from the elegant corner of a glittering London gala. I felt strange detachment, as though I were observing the final act of a tragic play I had wisely exited before its catastrophic conclusion. Victoria's fall was swift and merciless. The same people who had once excused her inappropriate closeness with Marcus now publicly distanced themselves with horror and disgust. Her family released statements claiming complete ignorance of her choices and cutting all financial ties. Former friends avoided her as though her legal troubles might be contagious. Even online, her name became synonymous with financial scandal and poor judgment. Photographs surfaced of her entering courthouse buildings with dark glasses hiding her eyes, flanked by lawyers who looked increasingly pessimistic about her chances of avoiding prison time. She made one final, pathetic attempt to reach me through email late at night. The message was longer than any previous communication, filled with grammatical errors that suggested she had been drinking while writing. She confessed that she had been foolish and completely blinded by Marcus's charismatic promises of wealth and social importance. She admitted she had betrayed my trust, acknowledged signing legal documents without proper consideration, and begged me to at least confirm to investigators that I had possessed no knowledge of Marcus's criminal activities. The irony was devastating. She wasn't asking me to save her anymore, only to protect myself by telling the truth about my ignorance of their schemes. I didn't respond personally. Isabel forwarded the email directly to authorities, where it became additional evidence in the expanding criminal case against both Victoria and Marcus. Months stretched into a full year as the legal proceedings continued. The case expanded internationally, pulling in criminal associates from across Europe and North America. Marcus, once arrogantly confident and seemingly untouchable, appeared in newspaper photographs wearing prison uniforms, his trademark smile replaced by the hollow stare of someone whose empire had crumbled into ash in legal documents. Victoria, facing charges of conspiracy, fraud, and money laundering, ultimately struck a plea deal to reduce her potential sentence in exchange for complete cooperation with international investigators. Even with that arrangement, she lost absolutely everything: her career, her reputation, her freedom, and every relationship that had once provided meaning to her existence. Meanwhile, my life in London continued to flourish beyond my most optimistic expectations. My professional responsibilities expanded throughout European markets, my investment portfolio grew substantially, and my relationship with Isabel evolved from partnership into something deeper and more meaningful than I had ever experienced with Victoria. Isabel grounded me in ways I hadn't realized I needed, reminding me daily that genuine strength wasn't about clinging to chaos, but about choosing stability, integrity, and mutual respect. Together, we built something quiet but unshakable, far removed from the emotional storms that had nearly destroyed my previous life. The final chapter of Victoria's story arrived unexpectedly through international mail forwarded through my company's office. It was a letter written from a minimum security detention facility, her handwriting steadier than before, her tone less frantic and more resigned to her circumstances. She wrote extensively about regret, not just for what she had done to me personally, but for every choice that had led her to that concrete cell. She admitted with painful honesty that Marcus had never genuinely loved her, that he had used her as nothing more than a financial shield and legal scapegoat, and that the only person who had ever truly cared for her well-being was the one she had systematically pushed away in favor of a manipulative criminal. I read her letter once, folded it carefully, and placed it in a drawer I rarely opened. I felt no triumph, no bitterness, only the profound finality that comes with absolute closure. Her words were echoes from a life I no longer inhabited, confessions that arrived years too late to change anything meaningful. 18 months later, I attended another charity gala with Isabel, this time as an officially engaged couple planning our wedding for the following spring. The whispers in that ballroom weren't about scandal, but about opportunity, innovation, and the future of European financial markets. Deals were being negotiated, partnerships forged, and ambitious futures mapped out by brilliant minds from across the globe. I stood on the terrace overlooking London's glittering skyline, Isabel's hand warm in mine, watching the Thames reflect city lights like scattered diamonds. The view stretched endlessly toward horizons that promised adventure rather than chaos, growth rather than destruction, love rather than manipulation. I thought back to that pivotal night in the Emirates Lounge at Heathrow when I had sent Victoria that photograph of my boarding pass. That single act of self-respect had been the turning point where my existence split into two distinct narratives: before and after, victim and victor, chaos and peace. Before had been emotional terrorism, jealousy disguised as love, manipulation masquerading as intimacy, and near financial ruin avoided only by geographic escape. After had been clarity of purpose, professional growth, genuine partnership, and the eventual triumph that comes from choosing self-worth over comfortable dysfunction. People often ask whether I ever think about Victoria, whether I wonder what our relationship could have become under different circumstances. The truth is, I don't engage in that kind of speculation because what happened was exactly what needed to happen. She told me once with supreme confidence that maybe we shouldn't be together if I couldn't handle her ex being around. She was absolutely right, though not in the way she had intended. I couldn't handle her ex because her ex was systematically destroying her life, and I refused to let his criminal enterprise drag me into legal and financial destruction alongside her. The consequences of that choice became devastatingly clear. Marcus sits behind bars, his empire reduced to evidence in multiple criminal cases. Victoria faces years of rebuilding a reputation shattered by her own decisions and misplaced loyalty. And me? I walked steadily forward, untouched by their mutual destruction, stronger for having recognized the difference between love and manipulation, wiser for having chosen self-preservation over codependent loyalty. Karma doesn't require witnesses to deliver justice, but sometimes it performs so publicly that no one can deny its mathematical precision. In the end, the only thing left for me to do was continue walking toward a future built on authentic love and mutual respect, away from the ruins of what had never truly been a relationship at all. The woman who once dismissed my legitimate concerns now knows the true cost of choosing manipulation over love, chaos over stability, criminal loyalty over honest partnership. Justice had never tasted sweeter than watching her face the consequences of decisions she had made with such arrogant confidence. If you've lived long enough to recognize toxic patterns in relationships, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Have you ever faced a moment when walking away felt impossible, but staying meant destroying yourself? What would you have done in my situation? Because sometimes the greatest act of love is refusing to participate in someone else's self-destruction, even when they're determined to drag you down with them.